Racist judge mocks teen in court, then realizes he's a brilliant lawyer and regrets everything. Jamal Carter stood in the crowded courtroom, sweat dripping from his forehead as Judge Holt sneered from the bench, sentencing his brother, Darius, to life for a crime he didn't commit. The all-white jury snickered. The gavel slammed, and Holt's mocking laugh rang out, echoing as he taunted the thin black teenager in a thrift store suit. Nobody knew that Jamal had memorized every law book in the library. No one saw the fire in his eyes. That laugh would haunt him forever, igniting a war he would fight alone against a system designed to crush him. What would Jamal do next? Before diving into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you stand for justice against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's explosive episode will leave you speechless. Jamal couldn't sleep that night. The echo of Judge Holt's laughter buzzed in his mind like a jagged knife cutting through every thought. His brother, Darius, was gone, locked away in a concrete cell 40 miles outside their crumbling southern city, all because a system saw black skin as a guilty verdict. The courtroom scene replayed in his mind. Smirks from the jury, the sharp crack of the gavel, and Holt's smug expression like he'd won some sick game. Jamal's fists clenched beneath the thin blanket in the small bedroom he shared with Darius until yesterday. A thrift store suit hung crooked on a nail, still wrinkled from the trial. Jamal stared at it, his chest tightening. He knew he couldn't let that laugh be the end. Not after spending years hunched over library tables memorizing legal codes while other teens played football or chased girls. He'd always known the law could be a weapon, but now it was his only weapon. By sunrise, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of cold coffee beside him, surrounded by Darius's case files. He had stolen them from the public defender's office 2 weeks ago, sneaking in during a lunch break when the overworked lawyer had left his desk unattended. The papers were a mess, coffee-stained and dog-eared, but Jamal's photographic memory cut through the chaos like a sharp blade. He found the arrest report. Darius, 22, accused of robbing a gas station on Peach Street and caught with a gun that wasn't his. The witness, a twitchy white cashier, swore Darius pulled the trigger, but the timestamps didn't line up. Jamal's pulse quickened as he flipped through the sentencing transcript, his eyes narrowing at Holt's final words. Life without parole. Case closed. No appeal. No fight. The defender had barely spoken. Jamal's jaw tightened. He'd do it himself. He spent the morning drafting an appeal, his hands trembling as he typed on a borrowed laptop from his neighbor, Miss Tasha. Every word had to be perfect, every statute airtight. Section 32 of the state code gave him 30 days post-sentencing to file, and it was already day 2. He cited ineffective counsel, procedural errors, and new evidence. A grainy photo from Darius's phone showing him at a barbershop 3 miles away when the robbery happened. By noon, he printed the appeal at the library, the machine humming as his future took shape. He stuffed the papers into a manila envelope, pulled on that wrinkled suit, and marched to the courthouse 3 blocks from his mom's sagging porch. The building loomed like a fortress, gray stone stained with decades of neglect. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and power. Jamal approached the clerk's desk, a wooden barrier manned by a middle-aged white woman with pinched lips and a badge reading Doris. He slid the envelope forward, his voice steady despite the sweat pooling under his collar. Filing an appeal for Darius Carter, case number 7629. Doris glanced up, her eyes raking over his faded tie and scuffed shoes. Boy, you can't just waltz in here with that mess. You a lawyer. Her tone dripped venom. The word boy was a slap. Jamal swallowed his fury, keeping his gaze level. I'm his brother. I've got the right to file under state law, Section 32, subsection B. Doris snorted, shoving the envelope back. We don't take trash from kids. Get a real attorney or get out. Jamal's stomach churned, but he didn't budge. He'd read the rules, he knew his rights. Ma'am, you're required to accept this. Refusal's a violation of my due process rights. Article 9 of the state constitution. Doris's face flushed purple, but before she could snap back, a balding man with a lazy eye ambled over. What's this nonsense? He muttered, snatching the papers from the counter. He skimmed them, then chuckled and tossed them into a bin. "Hallelujah! Some black kid thinks he's Perry Mason," he said. Jamal's blood boiled, but he kept his voice cold. "You're breaking the law. I'll report you to the state bar." The man smirked, leaning close enough that Jamal could smell his stale breath. "Go ahead, boy. Nobody cares." Word spread fast. By the afternoon, Judge Holt caught wind of the filing and summoned an emergency hearing. Jamal got the call from a courthouse runner, a skinny kid who looked as shocked as Jamal felt. "4 o'clock sharp." Holt's pissed. Jamal nodded, his heart hammering. He grabbed his notes, a spiral notebook crammed with scribbled statutes, and headed back, his suit sticking to his skin in the humid March air. The courtroom was half full when he arrived, a mix of bored reporters and Holt's cronies in cheap suits. Darius wasn't there, still locked away 40 miles away, but Jamal felt his brother's presence in every breath. Judge Raymond Holt swept in at 4 on the dot, his robes billowing like a vulture's wings. He was a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches with a buzz cut and a face carved from granite. His eyes glinted with malice. He'd ruled the city's courts for 20 years, a king who thrived on breaking people like Jamal. He settled onto the bench, gavel in hand, and fixed Jamal with a stare that could melt steel. "Mr. Carter," he drawled, his voice thick with southern syrup and scorn. "You're wasting my time. Explain this foolishness before I lock you up for disrespect." The gallery tittered, a ripple of amusement from men who'd never seen a black teen dare to stand before them. Jamal stepped to the podium, knees shaking but his spine straight. He clutched his notebook, the only shield between him and Holt's wrath. "Your Honor, I'm filing an appeal for my brother, Darius Carter." The trial was flawed. His counsel didn't challenge false testimony, and I've got evidence proving he wasn't at the crime scene. His voice cracked on the first sentence, thin and strained, but Holt pounced immediately. "You sound like a scared little boy playing lawyer. This ain't no school play. Sit down," the judge sneered. The room erupted in laughter, a chorus of jeers that burned Jamal's ears. He gripped the podium tighter, forcing his tone to remain steady. "I've got the law on my side, Your Honor. Section 32 gives me the right to appeal, and I found an error in the transcript." Holt's eyebrows shot up, more amused than alarmed. "A mistake? You're 16, son. You don't know a transcript from a comic book." Jamal opened his notebook, pointing to a line he'd circled in red ink. "Page 17, line 42. The prosecution's closing argument went past the court's deadline, 8 minutes over the allotted time. Per Rule 6.3 of the State Code, that voids the verdict." He slid the transcript across the podium, his hands trembling but his eyes locked on Holt. The judge snatched it, skimming the page with a scowl. The room went quiet, every breath held as Holt's face shifted from mockery to fury. Jamal pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "The law says a mimed closing invalidates the trial. You have to grant a retrial." Holt's jaw clenched, a vein pulsing in his thick neck. He slammed the transcript onto the bench with a crack that made Jamal flinch. The gallery gasped, a collective intake of air. Holt leaned forward, eyes blazing, but his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're a clever little rat, aren't you? Fine. Retrial granted. But don't think you've won anything." He banged the gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. "Court adjourned. Get out of my sight." Jamal exhaled, his legs wobbling as he gathered his papers. Reporters scribbled furiously, phones buzzing with the scoop. A black teen had forced Holt's hand. He'd done it. He'd cracked the wall. As he stepped into the hallway, a flicker of pride warmed his chest. Darius had a chance now. But then he saw Holt through the courtroom door, still on the bench, muttering into a phone. The judge's lips curled into a snarl, eyes flicking toward Jamal with pure hate. "Handle the kid," Holt growled into the receiver before hanging up. Jamal's stomach dropped. He'd won a battle, but Holt wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Whatever came next would be worse, and Jamal knew it. Jamal Carter stumbled out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun blinding after the dim, oppressive glow of Judge Holt's domain. His thrift store suit clung to his skin, damp with sweat from the battle he'd just fought and won. The retrial order buzzed in his head like a victory song, a fragile hope that Darius might breathe free air again. He clutched his notebook, pages crinkled from his death grip during the hearing, and started the 3-block trek home. The city streets hummed with life, horns blaring, kids shouting, but Jamal's mind was elsewhere. Could Holt really be forced to back down? Had he actually cracked the system just enough to break it open? His chest swelled with a flicker of triumph as he turned onto Sycamore Lane, the sagging row houses of his neighborhood coming into view. He was 50 feet from his front stoop when the screech of tires snapped him back to reality. A police cruiser lurched around the corner, gravel spitting under its wheels, and skidded to a stop inches from his legs. Jamal froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. 2 white cops spilled out, their uniforms crisp, faces twisted with menace. The taller one, a wiry man with a buzz cut and a scar slicing his left eyebrow, strode forward, baton swinging lazily at his side. Well, if it ain't Holt's little lawyer," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. The shorter cop, stocky with a sunburned neck, circled behind Jamal, boots crunching on broken glass. "You fit a description, boy. Armed and dangerous. Hands up." Jamal's stomach plummeted. Was this Holt's revenge already? How quickly could a judge's spite turn into a fist? "I'm not armed," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his knees. He raised his hands slowly and high, his notebook still clutched in his right fist. "Just came from court. You can check." The tall cop smirked, stepping closer until his coffee-sour breath hit Jamal's face. "Check? Oh, we'll check all right." Without warning, he slammed Jamal against the cruiser's hood, the metal hot from the sun, searing through his thin jacket. Pain flared across his chest as the cop's baton pressed into his spine. The shorter one yanked Jamal's arms back, snapping the cuffs tight enough to bite into his skin. "What's this?" he muttered, fishing in Jamal's pocket. His hand emerged with a baggie of weed, green and pungent. Weed Jamal had never seen before. "Looks like drugs to me." Jamal's mind raced, 1,000 laws flashing through his brain. "That's not mine." "You planted it," he shouted, twisting to face them. The tall cop laughed, a sharp bark that echoed Holt's courtroom cackle. "Planted? Hear that, Eddie? Kid thinks he's smart." Eddie, the stocky cop, grabbed Jamal by the collar and shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, trapping him in a cage of cracked vinyl and stale air. Through the window, he saw neighbors peering from their porches, eyes wide but mouths shut. Did they know this was a setup? Would anyone dare speak up? The engine roared, and the car peeled out, tires squealing as Jamal's world tilted into chaos. Inside the cruiser, the cops didn't hold back. The tall one drove, glancing back in the rearview mirror with a grin, while Eddie turned in the passenger seat, fist cocked. "Holt says, you need a lesson, genius?" Eddie growled, then smashed his knuckles into Jamal's jaw. Pain exploded, blood flooding his mouth, coppery and warm. Another blow landed on his ribs, a sickening crack stealing his breath. "Think you can embarrass a judge and walk away?" Eddie snarled, punching again. Jamal curled into himself, arms shielding his face, but the hits kept coming relentless, each one a message from Holt's throne. How far would they go? Could a 16-year-old survive this kind of hate? The precinct loomed ahead, a squat brick building ringed with razor wire, a fortress of fear in the heart of the city. They dragged Jamal inside, his sneakers scraping concrete, and shoved him into an interrogation room. The walls were gray, stained with desperation, and a single bulb buzzed overhead. Eddie uncuffed him, just to slam him into a metal chair. The impact jarred his bruised ribs. "Stay put, boy," the tall cop said, tossing the baggie onto the table. "You're looking at possession, maybe intent to sell. Hallelujah. Love putting you away too." Jamal spat blood onto the floor, glaring up through swollen eyes. "I know my rights. Article 12, State Code. I get a phone call. The cops exchanged a look, surprise flickering before the tall one shrugged. Fine. One call. Make it quick. He tossed a grimy phone across the table, its cord tangled like a noose. Jamal's hands shook as he dialed every digit. A lifeline. Ms. Lena picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp with worry. Jamal, what's wrong? Ms. Lena's voice cracked with concern. He swallowed, the pain-making words tumble out. Cops jumped me, planted drugs. I'm at the precinct. I need help. Lena didn't hesitate. Hold tight. I'm coming. The line clicked dead, and the tall cop snatched the phone from Jamal's hand, grinning. Good luck, kid. Nobody's saving you from Holt. Time dragged in that room, each minute pounding on Jamal's nerves. His jaw throbbed, and his ribs ached with every breath, but his mind stayed sharp, replaying the arrest, Section 15, unlawful search, Section 19, excessive force. He could fight this, if he survived long enough. Footsteps echoed outside, and the door swung open. Ms. Lena stormed in, a wiry black woman in her 50s, dreadlocks pulled tight, her eyes blazing with fury. She carried a bail receipt and a glare that made the cops flinch. You're done here, she snapped, slapping the paper down. He's out now. Eddie scowled, but the tall one waved him off. Take him. He's trash anyway. Jamal staggered to his feet, leaning on Lena as they shuffled out. The precinct's fluorescent lights stung his eyes, but freedom tasted sweeter than the blood in his mouth. Outside, dusk painted the sky orange, and Lena guided him to her beat-up sedan. They're Holt's, she muttered, starting the engine. He called in a favor the second you left court. Jamal nodded, wincing as he buckled in. I won't stop. Darius needs me. Lena's grip tightened on the wheel. You're brave, Jamal, but they'll kill you next time. You hear me? He stared out the window, the city blurring past. A war zone he couldn't escape. Had he pushed Holt too far already? The cop's laughter still echoed in his head as Lena drove him to her place, a shotgun house on the edge of town. She patched him up, antiseptic stinging his cuts. Her hands were steady, but her voice was tight. You're a target now. Holt's got power you can't imagine. Jamal clenched his fists, the pain grounding him. I'll find a way. I always do. She sighed, setting a glass of water beside him. Rest tonight. Tomorrow's a new fight. He nodded, sinking into her couch, but sleep wouldn't come. Sirens wailed in the distance, a promise of more to come. The tall cop's words looped in his head. Worse if you keep fighting. What did Holt have planned next? Jamal woke on Ms. Lena's couch, every muscle screaming from the cop's fists. Dawn crept through the cracked blinds, painting the tiny living room in streaks of gold. His jaw ached, a dull pulse where Eddie's knuckles had landed, and his ribs throbbed with each shallow breath. His thrift store suit lay crumpled beside him, stained with blood and dirt, a silent witness to yesterday's war. Lena shuffled in from the kitchen, her dreadlocks swaying as she set a mug of tea on the table. You're alive, she said, her voice rough with relief. That's a start. Jamal nodded, wincing as he sat up. I've got work to do. Darius's retrial's coming. Lena's eyes narrowed. After last night, Holt's not playing. Jamal, you're in his crosshairs. He ignored the warning, pulling his notebook from the suit's pocket. The pages were bent but intact, his lifeline to Darius. He'd won the retrial, but it meant nothing without proof. The photo from Darius's phone, timestamped 9:32 p.m. on the night of the robbery, showed him laughing at a barbershop on Elm Street, 3 miles from the gas station where the cashier claimed the holdup happened at 9:28. Jamal's lips twitched into a grim smile. It was a crack in the case, a shard of truth the jury couldn't ignore. He spent the morning at Lena's table, scribbling a motion to submit new evidence. His handwriting was jagged but precise. By noon, he was ready. The papers were stuffed into a fresh envelope from Lena's drawer. The walk to the courthouse felt longer today, every shadow a threat. His sneakers scuffed the pavement, still crusted with precinct filth, and his swollen face drew stares from passers-by. The building loomed ahead, its gray stone a monument to power he dared to challenge. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and judgment. Jamal approached the clerk's desk again, steeling himself for Doris. She wasn't there. Instead, a younger white man with slicked-back hair and a smirk leaned against the counter. His badge read Travis. Jamal slid the envelope forward. Motion to submit new evidence. K-7629, Darius Carter. Travis barely glanced at it, twirling a pen between his fingers. Another one. Huh? You don't quit, do you, kid? His tone was light, but his eyes were cold. A predator sizing up prey. Jamal kept his voice flat. Just follow State Code 34, subsection C, new evidence within 30 days. Travis chuckled, a sound that made Jamal's spine crawl. He took the envelope, tossing it onto a pile behind him. Sure thing, lawyer boy. We'll get right on that. The sarcasm stung, but Jamal turned away, notebook clutched tight. He'd done his part. The photo would hit the docket and Holt would have to face it. As he stepped outside, a breeze cooled his bruised face, and for a moment, he let himself hope. Maybe this was the edge he needed. That hope died the next morning. Lena shook him awake, her face tight with anger. Court called. Your motion's gone. They say it never made it to the judge. Jamal bolted upright, pain flaring, but he ignored it. What? I filed it myself. Lena handed him her phone, the courthouse number still on the screen. He dialed, heart pounding. Travis's voice oozed through. Oh, that must have got lost. Happens all the time with you people. The line clicked dead. Jamal's hands shook, rage boiling in his gut. Lost? He'd handed it to Travis, watched him take it. This wasn't an accident. It was Holt flexing his claws through the system. He stormed back to the courthouse, ignoring Lena's pleas to wait. The clerk's desk was a battlefield now, and Travis stood ready, grinning like he'd been waiting. Back so soon, he taunted, leaning forward. Told you, kid. It's gone. Black kids don't get justice here. Take the hint. Jamal slammed his fists on the counter, his voice rising. That's tampering, Jamal shouted. Section 41, State Code. I'll prove it. Travis laughed, loud and sharp, drawing curious looks from the hallway. Prove what? There aren't any cameras here. It's your word against mine. And guess who Holt believes? Jamal's chest tightened with each breath, fighting the despair that threatened to overtake him. He had no proof, no receipt, just his memory and a system that despised him. But he didn't back down. By the afternoon, he was back in Holt's courtroom, emotions scribbled on a piece of library paper, demanding an investigation. The gallery was more crowded this time, reporters sensing a story, their pens scratching like vultures circling a corpse. Holt swept in, his robes billowing, his granite face carved with fury. He didn't wait for Jamal to speak. Mr. Carter, he boomed. So you're clogging my docket with nonsense? Explain yourself before I have you hauled off for wasting my time. Jamal stepped forward, bruises pulsing beneath his skin, and held up the new motion. Your Honor, the clerk lost my evidence. A photo proving Darius wasn't at the robbery. I filed it yesterday and now it's gone. That's tampering. Holt's eyes glinted, like a predator spotting weakness. Lost, you say? Convenient excuse for a boy who can't keep up, he sneered. The gallery snickered, a wave of sound that burned Jamal's ears. He pushed forward, his voice cutting through. It's not an excuse. I handed it to Travis myself. He works for you, doesn't he? You're covering it up. The room gasped in shock, a collective jolt that electrified the air. Holt's face darkened, a storm brewing behind his scowl. You're accusing me of a crime, boy? That's contempt. $500 fine, payable now, or 30 days in lockup. He banged the gavel. The crack of the sound echoed, and he leaned back, smirking as Jamal stood frozen. Jamal had no money, no way to pay. His mom could barely scrape together rent, and Darius's commissary drained what little they had. He opened his mouth to argue, but a shout interrupted. I've got it! A young reporter, a black woman with braids and a fierce glare, stood in the gallery, waving cash. 500 right here. Let the kids speak. The crowd buzzed, phones flashing as she marched to the bench and slapped bills down. Holt's smirk faltered, but he took the money, tossing it to a bailiff. Fine paid, but your little stunt's over, Carter. Get out. Jamal nodded at the reporter, a silent thank you, and grabbed his notebook, his legs trembling as he left. Outside, the air crackled with chaos. The reporter, Aisha, caught up to him, camera in hand. That was insane, she said. I recorded it all. Holt losing it. Jamal blinked, hope flickering. You got the tampering claim? She grinned, tapping her phone. Every word is live now. People are pissed. By nightfall, the video exploded online. Hashtags like #MonkJusticeForDarius trending across the city. Protests sprouted outside the courthouse, chants echoing through the streets. Jamal watched from Lena's window, his heart pounding as crowds swelled, signs bobbing in the dusk. He'd struck a nerve. Maybe this was it, the tide turning. But then he saw Holt. The judge stood in his office window across town, silhouetted against the glow, his phone pressed to his ear. His lips moved fast, a sneer twisting his face as he stared into the night. Jamal's stomach sank. Holt wasn't shaken, he was plotting. Minutes later, Lena's phone rang, an unknown number. She answered, her face paling as she listened. Jamal, she whispered, hanging up. That was a friend downtown. Holt's calling in muscle. Something big's coming. Jamal's fists clenched, the viral fame souring in his gut. He'd lit a fire, but Holt was ready to burn it all down. What had he unleashed? Jamal Carter stood at Ms. Lena's window, the glass cool against his bruised knuckles as he watched the protests swell below. The street pulsed with life, a sea of fists and signs scrawled with "Free Darius" and "Down with Holt" in bold, angry strokes. Aisha's video had ignited a firestorm, her footage of Holt's courtroom snarl looping online, racking up millions of views overnight. Chants rolled through the dusk, a rhythm of rage that shook the sagging houses of Jamal's neighborhood. His chest tightened with a mix of pride and dread. Had he finally cracked the system wide open? Could this be the push that brought Darius home? The air crackled with possibility, but the shadow of Holt's phone call loomed in his mind, a storm cloud waiting to burst. Lena paced behind him, her dreadlocks swaying as she clutched her phone. This is big, Jamal. Bigger than you planned. Her voice was tight, edged with worry she couldn't hide. He nodded, eyes fixed on the crowd. They're listening. That's what matters. But even as he spoke, unease gnawed at him. The courthouse sat 3 blocks away, a gray fortress now ringed with bodies. Their shouts bounced off its stone walls. Police lights flashed in the distance, red and blue slicing through the twilight. But the cops held back, an ominous stillness that didn't sit right. What was Holt waiting for? Why hadn't he struck yet? The answer came fast and brutal. As night fell, the protests thickened, spilling into side streets. Jamal stepped onto Lena's porch, the air thick with humidity and tension, when a roar erupted 2 blocks over. Tires screeched, and a pack of pickup trucks roared into view, Confederate flags flapping from their beds. White men in hoodies and boots poured out, bats and pipes gleaming in their hands. Jamal's stomach dropped. A supremacist mob, eyes wild with hate, charged the protesters, swinging without mercy. Screams pierced the night as fists met flesh. Signs splintered, and blood stained the pavement. Was this Holt's muscle? Had the judge unleashed a war on his own streets? Jamal bolted back inside, slamming the door as Lena grabbed a baseball bat from the closet. "Get down!" she hissed, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the window. The mob carved through the crowd, targeting black faces with savage precision. A woman fell, clutching her head, red seeping through her fingers. A teen, Jamal's age, crumpled under a pipe, his cries drowned by the chaos. Sirens wailed, but the cops stayed blocks away, their lights a mocking glow. Jamal's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. "They're not stopping it," he whispered, his voice shaking. Lena gripped his shoulder hard. "Holt's behind this. He's sending a message." An hour later, Jamal found the message. He had slipped out the back, cutting through alleys to avoid the chaos. But when the mob's roar closed in, 5 of them broke off, spotting him in the flicker of a streetlight. Their hoodies were stained with sweat and blood, their bats dripping red. "There's Holt's little lawyer," one of them yelled, a hulking man with a shaved head and a swastika tattoo creeping up his neck. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. Has he turned to run? But the alley was narrowing, trash cans blocking his path. Could he outrun them? Did he stand a chance against that kind of hate? They caught him in seconds, boots pounding the pavement like thunder. The tattooed leader swung first, the bat cracking against Jamal's shoulder. Pain exploded as he stumbled into a wall. Another hit slammed his knee, buckling his leg, and a third smashed into his ribs, the same spot the cops had bruised. He crumpled, tasting blood as they circled him, shouting slurs that burned deeper than the blows. "Thinks he's smart," one spat, kicking his side. "Holt says you're done," another roared, raising a pipe for a killing strike. Jamal's vision blurred, but his mind raced, scanning for any chance to escape. A sewer grate glinted about 10 feet away, rusted but loose. Could he make it? Was this his only shot? He rolled, pain searing every inch, and lunged for the grate. His fingers clawed at the metal, prying it free just as a bat whistled past his head, splintering brick. The mob laughed, closing in, but Jamal squeezed through, his skinny frame slipping into the dank tunnel below. His feet hit slimy concrete, and he ran, the darkness swallowing him as their curses echoed above. The stench of rot water splashed his shins, but he didn't stop, navigating by touch until he found a ladder. He climbed, lungs burning, and emerged into a quiet lot, the mob's shouts fading behind him. Blood dripped from his nose, his shoulders screamed, but he was alive. A fragile wind stirred as he limped back to Lena's, sneaking through backyards. Every rustle felt like a threat. She met him at the door, eyes wide, pulling him inside. "Jesus, Jamal," she gasped, grabbing a towel to press against his face. "They almost killed you." He sank onto the couch, breath ragged, as she cleaned his cuts, her hands trembling. "Holt sent them," he muttered, voice barely a whisper. "They knew my name." Lena's jaw tightened. "He's not just a judge. He's a kingpin. This city is his." Jamal nodded, the truth sinking in. The protests, the video, his fight, they'd rattled Holt's throne. And now the judge was striking back with fists and steel. By morning, the news was everywhere. Aisha's crew had caught the mob on camera, shaky footage of bats and slurs lighting up screens across the country. Online supporters hailed Jamal as a hero, a black teen defying a racist tyrant. Hashtag Jamal Fights Back trended. Donations poured in for Darius's case. Jamal watched from Lena's laptop, a flicker of hope battling the ache in his bones. Maybe this was it, the pressure Holt couldn't avoid. But then the TV flickered to a breaking story. His family's apartment was a charred skeleton against the dawn sky. The mob had torched it overnight, flames licking the thrift store suit he'd left behind. His mom stood on the curb, sobbing into a neighbor's arms. Homeless now, everything gone. Jamal's throat closed, guilt clawing at his chest. Had he brought this on her? Was his fight costing too much? Lena muted the TV, her voice soft but firm. "They're trying to break you. Don't let them." He nodded, tears stinging his cuts, but rage burned hotter. He had survived again. The world was watching, and Holt was slipping across town. The judge stood in his office, TV flickering with the fire's glow, a grin splitting his granite face. He dialed a number, his voice low and venomous. "Burning's not enough. Finish it." The line clicked, and his eyes glinted with a promise of worse to come. Jamal didn't see that. He sat in Lena's dim living room, bandaged and battered, staring at the laptop screen. The protests roared louder now, a city on edge. But the mob's attack had shifted something. Holt wasn't just fighting in court anymore. He was waging war on the streets. Jamal's shoulder throbbed, a reminder of how close he'd come to dying. He'd outsmarted them this time, But the fire was a gut punch, a wound deeper than any bat could leave. What would Holt unleash next? Comment with a 1 if you think Jamal's risking too much for justice, or a 2 if you'll torch the system right alongside him. The video continued. Like and subscribe if you're hooked on this fight, because the next blow is going to hit harder than you can imagine. So how does Holt top a burning home? Will Jamal dodge the judge's next strike? Or has he just painted a bigger target on his back? Jamal Carter sat in Ms. Lena's cramped kitchen, the smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee thick in the air. His shoulder throbbed under a makeshift sling. His ribs ached with every breath, and his swollen face bore the mob's brutal signature. The TV flickered silently in the corner, replaying the smoldering ruins of his family's apartment. A wound that cut deeper than any bruise. His mom was safe, crashing with a cousin across town. But the loss gnawed at him, guilt and rage twisting in his gut. Lena hovered nearby, her dreadlocks pulled back, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "You can't stay here long," she said, her voice low. "Holt's not done." Jamal nodded, staring at his notebook, its pages warped from sewer water but still legible. "I've got to keep going. Darius is counting on me." He spent the morning piecing together the retrial strategy, his mind a steel trap despite the pain. The photo was gone, torched with everything else, but he'd memorized every detail. Darius at the barber shop, 9:32 p.m., laughing with a razor in hand. He needed more, something Holt couldn't bury. Lena's phone buzzed, and she answered, her face softening. "It's a lawyer, white guy. Says he saw Aisha's video. Wants to help." Jamal's pulse quickened. A real attorney could shift the game, give him the muscle he lacked. "Tell him to come," he said, hope flickering through the haze of defeat. Tom Grayson arrived by noon, a lanky man in his 30s with sandy hair and a crisp gray suit that screamed money. He carried a leather briefcase, his blue eyes sharp but warm as he shook Jamal's hand. "I saw you take on Holt," he said, his voice smooth with a faint northern twang. "Kid, you're a damn prodigy. I want in." Jamal studied him, wary, but desperate. "Why help me?" Tom grinned, setting the briefcase on the table. "Holt's a bully. I've got a soft spot for underdogs, and you're the toughest I've seen." Lena raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting Jamal make the decision. He nodded, cautious trust settling in. "All right, let's get Darius out." They dived into the case together. Tom's legal finesse blended with Jamal's raw brilliance. By afternoon, they had uncovered gold. A police report buried in the precinct's digital archive, timestamped 9:40 p.m., stating a witness saw Darius at the barber shop during the robbery window. Tom whistled, scrolling through the file on his laptop. Holt's crew hid this, probably paid off the clerk to lose it. Jamal's fists clenched, the memory of Travis's smirk flashing hot. "Can we use it?" Tom nodded, typing quickly. "Oh, we'll use it. I'll co-counsel the retrial." Holt won't know what hit him. For the first time in days, Jamal felt the tide shift. A real chance was blossoming amidst the wreckage. The retrial came 2 days later. The courthouse was packed to the rafters. Reporters crammed into the gallery, cameras rolling, their buzz a live wire through the stale air. Jamal walked in beside Tom, his thrift store suit replaced with a borrowed blazer from Lena's nephew. Still too big, but cleaner than the blood-stained rags he had worn before. Holt swept onto the bench, robes billowing, his granite face a mask of barely contained fury. His eyes locked on Jamal, glinting with malice, but flickered to Tom with a hint of unease. "Counselor Grayson," he drawled, "didn't expect you slumming it with this one." Tom smiled, cool and unshaken. "Justice isn't slumming. Your Honor, let's begin." Jamal took the podium, heart pounding but voice steady. "Your Honor, we've got new evidence proving Darius Carter's innocence. A police report filed at 9:40 p.m. places him 3 miles from the crime scene during the robbery." He handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to Holt. The judge skimmed it, jaw tightening, a vein pulsing in his thick neck. The gallery murmured, tension coiling tight. "This is admissible," Jamal pressed, citing Section 34. subsection C, his memory sharp, slicing through Holt's glare. It shows the prosecution's timeline is a lie. Holt squirmed in his chair, creaking under his bulk, but said nothing. His silence was a crack in his armor. Tom stepped up, smooth as silk. We've also got witness testimony corroborating the report. Darius was at the barber shop, not Peach Street. The state's case falls apart. He slid a sworn affidavit across, signed by the barber, a grizzled black man who had dodged Holt's threats. The room buzzed, reporters scribbling, phones flashing. Holt's face turned red, sweat beading on his buzz cut, but he gripped the bench, fighting for control. "This is thin," he snapped, voice a growl. "You're grasping, Grayson." Jamal shot back. "It's the truth. You can't bury it this time." The gallery gasped, a jolt of shock. Holt's eyes blazed, a predator cornered. Then the trap sprang. Tom cleared his throat, stepping forward with a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I've got something else." His tone shifted, oily now, and Jamal's gut twisted. Tom handed the stack to Holt, who smirked as he read. These documents show Jamal Carter fabricated the police report, forged timestamps, fake signatures. He's been playing us all. The room erupted, shouts drowning Jamal's stunned silence. He spun to Tom, voice cracking. "What? That's a lie." Tom avoided his gaze, cool as ice. "Sorry, kid. Truth's the truth." Holt banged the gavel, a triumphant crack. "Order. This changes everything. Trial suspended, pending investigation. Carter, you're under arrest for fraud." Jamal's world tilted, betrayal slicing deeper than any mob's bat. The bailiff lunged, cuffs snapping on his wrists, cold metal biting his bruised skin. "You set me up," Jamal shouted at Tom, struggling as guards dragged him back. Tom shrugged, adjusting his tie. "Holt's the boss, kid. You should have known." The gallery roared, cameras catching every second of Jamal's downfall. But the victory Jamal had tasted turned to ash. Holt leaned forward, grinning like a wolf over a kill. "Told you, boy. You don't win here." The gavel slammed again, and Jamal was hauled out, legs kicking, voice full of rage. They shoved him into a holding cell, a concrete box stinking of piss and despair. The door clanged shut, locking him in with the echo of Tom's words. Holt's puppet all along. The police report, the affidavit, they'd been real. But Tom had twisted them into a noose. Jamal sank to the floor, cuffs chafing, his mind racing despite the weight of betrayal. He had trusted too fast, let hope blind him. The protests outside still echoed faintly through the thick walls, a lifeline he couldn't reach. How had Holt pulled this off? How deep did his claws sink? Across town, Holt sat in his office, the TV muted on a loop of Jamal's arrest. He poured bourbon into a glass, ice clinking, and toasted the screen. "One down," he muttered, dialing a number. Grayson did his part. Now make sure the brother stays quiet. The line clicked, and Holt leaned back, savoring the burn of liquor and power. Jamal's fight had rattled him, sure, but this was checkmate, or so he thought. In the cell, Jamal's eyes hardened, replaying every word, every move. Tom's betrayal had been a gut punch, but it wasn't the end. He would find a way out. He always did. But what came next would test him like never before. Jamal Carter slumped against the cold concrete wall of the holding cell, the clang of the door still ringing in his ears. The cuffs bit into his wrists, a cruel reminder of Tom Grayson's betrayal. The dim bulb overhead buzzed like a swarm of angry wasps. The cell stank of sweat and despair. A 6x8 box with a rusted cot and a toilet that hadn't been cleaned in years. His bruised ribs throbbed. His shoulder screamed under the sling, and blood crusted his swollen lip from the mob's attack. Holt's voice echoed in his skull, that smug, "You don't win here," a taunt he couldn't shake. Was this it? Had he finally pushed too far? Footsteps thudded outside, and the door creaked open. Two guards loomed in the doorway, both white, both grinning with a hunger that made Jamal's stomach twist. The first, a hulking man with a buzz cut and a scar across his chin, cracked his knuckles. Holt's punching bag, he sneered, stepping in. The second, leaner with a patchy beard, twirled a baton, his eyes glinting. Time to teach you some manners, boy. Jamal straightened, heart pounding, but his voice remained steady. You've got no right. Article 19, excessive force is illegal. The scarred one laughed, a guttural sound that bounced off the walls. Rights down here? Holt's the law. The beating started fast. The scarred guard swung first, his fists slamming into Jamal's jaw, snapping his head back against the wall. Pain flared white-hot as the lean one drove the baton into his gut, doubling him over. They didn't stop, trading blows like a choreographed dance. Each hit was a message. Stop fighting, give up, die. The scarred one grunted, kneeing Jamal's ribs until something cracked. Holt owns you now, the lean one hissed, smashing the baton across his shins. Jamal crumpled, blood pooling in his mouth, but his mind clung to survival, cataloging every move. Could he use this? Was there a way out? Days blurred into a haze of violence. They came twice a day, morning and night, dragging him from the cot to the floor, fists and boots, a relentless storm. The guards rotated, but the script stayed the same. Slurs, blows, Holt's name spat like a curse. Lawyer's done, one growled, stomping his hand. Stay down, another barked, kicking his spine. Jamal stopped counting the bruises, stopped feeling the pain as anything but fuel. He memorized their patterns. Scarface favored his right fist. Batman limped on his left leg. A third had a lazy eye that blinked too slowly. Knowledge was power, even in this hell. By the fifth day, he saw his chance. The guards had grown sloppy, bored with a kid who wouldn't break. Scarface left a spoon on the tray. One night, a dented scrap of metal. Jamal palmed it before they noticed, hiding it under the cot, waiting for the right moment. His mind churned, legal codes mixing with survival instincts. Section 15, right to humane treatment, mocked him here, but escape laws danced in his head. Could it be self-defense? Could he pull this off? Would the system care if he did? Night fell and a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled through the precinct's thick walls, rain lashing the barred window high above. The lean guard came alone that night. Batman, his limp worse in the damp, unlocked the cell, smirking as he twirled the baton. Holt says you're too quiet. Let's fix that. Jamal stayed still, curled on the cot, the spoon tucked in his sleeve. The guard stepped closer, raising the baton, and Jamal moved. He sprang up, driving the spoon's edge into Baton Man's bad knee. A sickening pop as the man howled and dropped. Jamal snatched the baton, cracking it across the guard's skull, then bolted for the open door. Alarms blared, red lights flashing, but the storm drowned the chaos, thunder masking his footsteps. He darted down the hall, bare feet slapping wet concrete. Every turn was a gamble, his memory guiding him, a map built from 5 days of listening. Left at the buzzing light, right past the leaking pipe. Shouts echoed behind him, boots pounding, but the storm was his ally, rain hammering the roof like a drum roll. He found a supply closet door ajar and slipped inside, heart slamming as he scanned the dark. A loose panel in the wall caught his eye, rusted screws barely holding it. He wedged the baton under, prying until it gave, revealing a crawl space thick with dust. Could this be it? Was freedom worth the risk? He squeezed through, ribs scraping, crawling blind, the spoon now a lifeline in his grip. The space widened, and he dug, clawing at crumbling mortar until a brick shifted. Then another. Rain poured through, soaking him as he punched a hole big enough to fit. He tumbled out, landing in a puddle behind the precinct. Lightning split the sky, sirens wailed, but the storm cloaked him, a black shadow in a white night. He ran, lungs burning, until he hit a familiar alley 3 miles away. Miss Lena's safe house loomed through the downpour. She yanked him inside, eyes wide at his battered state. "Jamal, what did you do?" she asked. He collapsed on her floor, water pooling around him, and gasped out the truth. "Broke out. Had to. They'd have killed me." Lena locked the door, grabbing a blanket. Her voice trembled. Holt's running a racket, framing black kids like Darius, pocketing cash from private prisons. I heard it from a cop friend tonight. Jamal's head snapped up, pain forgotten. A racket? Proof. She nodded, pulling a recorder from her pocket. Caught him on tape. Names, dates, money. His eyes blazed. A fire rekindled. I'll use it. I'll bury him. Lena patched him up, antiseptic stinging his cuts. Her hands steady but her face grim. You're a fugitive now. They'll hunt you. Jamal gripped the blanket, resolve hardening. Let them. I've got Holt's number. He replayed the tape, a grainy voice listing payoffs, Darius's name among dozens. It was dynamite enough to blow Holt's empire apart. He'd expose it, bring the judge down for good. But as he planned, sirens wailed closer, a howl cutting through the storm. Lena froze, peering out the blinds. They're here. They tracked you. Jamal's stomach dropped, the tape still in his hand. Had his escape just sealed his fate? Comment with a 1 if you think Jamal's jailbreak was a genius move, or a 2 if you would have stayed and fought from the inside. Like and subscribe if you're rooting for this kid to turn Holt's racket into rubble, because the next chapter is going to shake this city to its core. So how does Jamal dodge the sirens? Will he outsmart Holt's hunters? Or has he just stepped into a trap too tight to slip? Jamal Carter froze as the sirens sliced through the storm, their wail a blade against the drumming rain. Miss Lena's safe house, a shotgun shack on the city's ragged edge, trembled under the sound. Its thin walls no match for Holt's reach. The recorder sat heavy in his hand, its tape a ticking bomb of truth. Holt's voice, cold and clipped, listing payoffs for framing black teens like Darius. Jamal's bruised ribs ached, his swollen jaw pulsed, but his mind raced sharp as ever. They're here, Lena whispered, peering through the blinds, her dreadlocks pulled tight against her scalp. How'd they find you so fast? Jamal's stomach churned. The precinct was 3 miles away. The storm had been his shield. Someone had talked. Red and blue lights flashed outside, painting the room in jagged streaks. Jamal sprang to his feet, the blanket slipping off him as water still dripped from his soaked clothes. We've got to move, he said, his voice firm but urgent. Lena grabbed her bat, nodding toward the back door. Through the yard. They slipped out, rain pelting their faces. The night was a blur of shadows and thunder. Jamal clutched the recorder, its plastic slick with moisture, as they darted past rusted junk and overgrown weeds. The sirens grew louder, boots splashing closer, and then the world exploded. Gunshots ripped through the storm, bullets tearing into the shack's wooden siding, splintering it like paper. Lena screamed, shoving Jamal down as a round whizzed past his ear, embedding in a fence post. He hit the mud, pain flaring through his cracked ribs. He saw them, 6 cops in tactical gear, faces masked, guns drawn, fanning out from the front. "One!" Someone shouted, voice muffled but sharp, pointing their way. Jamal's heart slammed against his chest. This wasn't an arrest. This was a hit. Holt wasn't playing anymore. He'd sent a death squad. Lena yanked him up, her bat swinging wildly as she pulled him toward the next yard. "Run!" she yelled, her voice roaring over the gunfire. They sprinted, weaving through backyards, chain-link fences rattling as they vaulted over. Bullets chewed the ground behind them, mud spraying, and Jamal's legs burned. His battered body protested with every step. He glanced back, seeing Lena stumble, her bat slipping from her grip. Cop closed in, rifle raised, and fired. The shot hit her shoulder, blood blooming dark against her shirt. She fell, a guttural cry cutting through the rain. Jamal skidded to a stop, lungs heaving. "Lena!" She clutched her arm, her face twisted in pain, but waved him off. "Go. Get the tape out." Her eyes blazed fiercely, even as blood soaked her sleeve. The cop loomed over her, boot pressing her down, but Jamal couldn't stay. Another shot cracked, grazing his arm, a hot sting that snapped him back. He turned and ran, tears mixing with rain. Lena's scream echoed in his skull. She'd saved him twice now, and he'd left her to die. The recorder dug into his palm, a lifeline he couldn't lose, but guilt clawed at his chest, heavier than any bruise. He cut through a maze of alleys, the city's underbelly a tangle of trash and shadows. Sirens wailed behind, closing in, but the storm cloaked his trail, thunder drowning his gasps. He dove into a junkyard, rusted cars towering like skeletal giants, and crouched behind a gutted sedan, breath ragged. The cops fanned out, flashlights slicing the dark. Their shouts were lost to the wind. Jamal's mind raced, replaying Lena's fall, the tape's weight, a promise and a curse. He had to outsmart them, had to survive. He grabbed a hubcap, tossing it hard to his left. It clanged against a pile of scrap, a sharp echo, and the light swung that way, boots pounding toward the decoy. Jamal bolted right, slipping through a gap in the fence, mud sucking at his sneakers. His arm bled steadily, but adrenaline kept him moving. He hit a quiet street, houses dark and shuttered, and ducked into a shed. The door hung loose. The space stank of oil and rot, but it was cover, a moment to breathe. He sank against the wall, recorder clutched to his chest, and listened. The sirens faded, the storm swallowing their hunt, but his pulse wouldn't slow. Lena was gone. Her blood was on his hands, and Holt had won this round. Or had he? Morning broke, gray and heavy, the rain easing to a drizzle. Jamal slipped out, limping to a payphone 2 blocks away, the last relic of a forgotten era. He dialed Aisha, the reporter who'd bankrolled his fine. Her number burned into his memory. She picked up fast, her voice tense. "Jamal, where are you?" He swallowed, throat dry. "Safe for now. Lena's dead. Cops ambushed us. I've got proof. Holt's running a racket." Aisha gasped, static crackling. "Proof? What kind?" He gripped the recorder, its tape a weapon. "Payoffs, names, all of it. Can you get it out?" She didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the library back entrance in 1 hour." He made it, every step a gamble. The city was waking around him. Aisha waited in a beat-up hatchback, braids tucked under a cap, eyes wide as he slid in. He handed her the tape, his arm shaking, blood staining the seat. "Holt sent them to kill me," he said, his voice flat. She nodded, slotting the tape into a player. Holt's voice spilled out, cold and damning, listing dates and dollars, Darius's name a footnote in a ledger of corruption. Aisha's jaw tightened. "This is huge. I'll hack a police radio and broadcast it live. People need to hear." Jamal leaned back, exhaustion hitting hard. "Do it fast. They're still coming." By noon, the tape hit the airwaves, Aisha's crew patching it through a pirated signal. Holt's voice boomed across the city, raw and unfiltered, sparking outrage. Protests flared, new, bigger, angrier crowds choking the streets. Online, the audio went viral, millions sharing the proof of Holt's racket. Jamal watched from Aisha's hideout, a dingy attic above a bar. The TV flickered with chaos. Supporters hailed him a fugitive hero, donations flooding in. Again, he'd struck back, turned Holt's weapon against him. For a moment, he let himself believe it was enough, that Darius might walk free on this wave. But then he saw it. A glint in the attic window, a sniper scope catching the midday sun. His breath caught, body tensing. He dropped to the floor. Aisha spun, confused, but he grabbed her arm, pulling her down. "They're here," he whispered, heart hammering. The scope vanished, but the message was clear. Holt wasn't done. Across town, the judge sat in his office. The TV blared the tape, Holt's granite face a mask of fury. He smashed the bourbon glass against the wall, shards scattering, and dialed a number. "He's still alive," he growled. "Fix it now." The line clicked, and Holt's eyes burned with a promise of blood in their depths. Jamal crawled to the window, peering out. The street below was eerily quiet, too quiet, like a trap waiting to spring. Aisha gripped the player, the tape still inside, her hands trembling. "They won't stop," she said, her voice small. Jamal nodded, his mind racing. He had survived the ambush, kept the tape alive. But Lena's death was a scar he couldn't erase. Holt had escalated to murder, and the sniper was proof, no more games, just bullets. He'd bought time, lit a fire across the city, but the hunter was closing in. This attic wouldn't hold for long. What came next would be life or death. Jamal Carter crouched beneath the attic window. The sniper's glint still burned into his retinas, a silent promise of death. Aisha huddled beside him, her breath shallow. The tape player clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The attic above the bar felt like a coffin, the wood splintered and dusty. The air was thick with the stench of stale beer drifting up from below. Rain pattered on the roof, a faint echo of the storm from last night. But the quiet outside was louder, a predator's stillness before the strike. Jamal's arm bled through his sleeve, a dull ache from the graze. His ribs ached from the mob and jail. Lena's blood-soaked scream replayed in his mind, a wound that wouldn't close. Had Holt really turned the city into a kill zone? Was there no line he wouldn't cross? He crawled to Aisha's laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. "We need more," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The tape's big, but Holt's still standing." Aisha nodded, her braids brushing her shoulders as she powered it up. "What's the play?" Jamal's mind churned, legal codes colliding with survival instincts. "If he's running a racket, there's a trail. We hack him, leak it all." Aisha's eyes widened, but her fingers flew across the keys. "Risky. He'll have security." Jamal's jaw tightened. "He's got snipers. Risk is already here. Could they pull this off? Would Holt's own words bury him deeper?" Aisha cracked into the library's public Wi-Fi, a weak signal, but enough to work. She navigated dark web forums, her hacker passing a lifeline, and within an hour, they breached Holt's private server. Jamal watched, heart pounding, as emails flooded the screen. Payoffs to cops, orders to frame kids, even a hit list with Darius's name circled in red. One stood out, dated yesterday. "Grayson's in. Finish the boy tonight." Jamal's stomach twisted. Tom's betrayal was a fresh stab, but the real prize was a memo to a private prison CEO. 10 grand per head. Black teens priority. Holt's racket laid bare. A machine of greed and hate. "This is it," Aisha breathed, copying files to a drive, enough to sink him. They moved fast, uploading the emails to a rogue journalist site Aisha trusted, a whistleblower page beyond Holt's reach. By dusk, the leak hit like a digital wildfire, racing through the city. News stations picked it up, anchors stammering over Holt's words. "Keep the jails full, profits up." Protests exploded, bigger than before. Crowds choked downtown, chanting, "Holt must fall." Jamal peered out the window. The street below was alive with flickering lights, a sea of rage he'd unleashed. Online, the world roared. The feds announced a probe into Holt's court. Had he finally cornered the judge? Could this be the knockout blow? The retrial loomed. The next morning, the courthouse became a battlefield Jamal couldn't miss. He slipped out at dawn, Aisha's cap pulled low over his swollen face, the borrowed blazer stiff with dried mud. The courthouse was a war zone, protesters clashing with riot cops, tear gas clouding the air. Jamal pushed through, lungs burning, and made it inside. The gallery was packed with cameras and fury. Holt stormed in, his robes billowing, his granite face a mask of barely contained wrath. His eyes locked on Jamal, a predator tasting blood, but the crowd's buzz rattled him, a throne shaking underfoot. "Order!" he bellowed, his gavel cracking, but his voice trembled, a crack in the armor. Jamal took the podium, legs shaking but his spine steel. "Your Honor, new evidence has surfaced. Emails proving you framed my brother and dozens more. You're running a racket with the prisons." He held up the printouts Aisha had rushed him, Holt's own words in black ink, and slid them to the bailiff. The gallery erupted, shouts drowning Holt's snarl as he snatched the papers. His buzz cut gleamed with sweat, his thick neck pulsing as he read. "This is slander," he roared, slamming the stack down. "You're a fugitive, Carter. No standing here." Jamal fired back, voice cutting through. Section 34, subsection D. Evidence of corruption overrides that. You're exposed. Tom Grayson stood at the prosecution table, his suit crisp, his sandy hair unruffled. He smirked and stepped forward. Your Honor, this is a stunt. The emails are fake, cooked up by a desperate kid. Jamal spun, rage boiling. You're on them, Tom. You sold me out. The room buzzed, cameras flashing, but Holt seized the chaos. Enough. I'm suspending this trial. Fraud investigation still active. He banged the gavel. A desperate crack, but Jamal pressed on. The feds are coming, Holt. Your racket's done. Holt's face turned purple, a vein bulging. He leaned forward, spitting venom. You think you've won, boy? You're nothing. The bailiff moved, but the crowd's roar held him back. A tidal wave of outrage. Holt's chair creaked as he stood, towering over the bench and pointed at Jamal. Mistrial declared. Get him out. Guards lunged, but protesters stormed the doors, blocking their way. Jamal slipped through, his heart hammering, the printout still clutched tightly. Outside, the air was thick with gas and screams, but he had done it. Holt squirmed. The feds circled. A victory forged from betrayal and blood. He ducked into an alley, breath ragged, thinking he had turned the tide. But Holt wasn't finished. Across town, the judge paced his office, the TV blaring the leak. The bourbon bottle was empty on his desk. He dialed a number, his voice a low growl. He's still breathing. Move the plan up. The line clicked, and his granite face twisted into a snarl. At the same moment, feds raided Jamal's hideout, Aisha's attic, guns drawn, shouting, "Threat to public order." They found it empty, but hauled him in from the alley, cuffs snapping tight. A black van swallowed him whole. Jamal landed in solitary, a concrete tomb deeper than the precinct's cell. No light, no sound, just the echo of Holt's laugh in his head. Had he pushed too far? Was this Holt's final checkmate? The feds' boots faded, leaving Jamal in darkness. The emails, his triumph, soured fast. He'd exposed the racket, lit a fire under Holt's throne, but now he was buried, just a ghost in a system that hated him. His arm throbbed, blood crusting a new wound, but his mind stayed sharp. He replayed the leak, the courtroom chaos. The feds weren't justice. They were Holt's shield, a twist he hadn't seen coming. He'd won a battle, but the war was slipping through his fingers, and Holt's next move loomed. An ever-present shadow he couldn't outrun. Comment with a 1 if you think Jamal's hack was worth the heat, or a 2 if he should have played it safer with Holt on his tail. Like and subscribe if you're hooked on this kid's fight to burn the system down, because the next twist is going to hit like a freight train. So what's Holt's endgame now? Can Jamal claw his way out of solitary? Or has the judge finally caged the genius for good? Jamal Carter sat in the black void of solitary, the concrete floor cold against his bruised legs. The silence weighed heavier than the cuffs chaining his wrists to the wall. The cell was a tomb 6 feet square. No window, no cot, just a drain in the corner, stinking of rust and rot. His arm bled through the sling, a slow drip from the sniper's graze. His ribs cracked and screamed with every breath. The feds had dumped him here hours ago, their boots echoing away, leaving him at Holt's mercy. Darkness pressed in, but his mind burned, replaying the leaked emails, the courtroom chaos, Aisha's voice on the hacked radio. Had he pushed Holt too far? Was this the judge's final cage? The door screeched open, metal grinding on metal, and light stabbed his eyes. 3 guards loomed, shadows against the glare. Their uniforms were crisp, but their faces twisted with hate. The leader, a squat man with a shaved head and a scar curling his lip, carried a hose, water dripping from its nozzle. Holt's little genius, he sneered, voice thick with venom. The others flanked him, one with a cattle prod sparking blue, the other cracking his knuckles, tattooed with swastikas. Jamal straightened, chains rattling, and spat blood onto the floor. "You can't break me," he rasped. "Article 15, humane treatment, you're breaking it." Scarlett laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Down here, boy. Holt writes the rules. They didn't waste time. Scarlett aimed the hose, blasting Jamal with ice-cold water. The force slammed him back, the chains biting his wrists. His gasp was drowned as they pinned him. The prod's wielder jabbed it into his side, electricity searing through his muscles. Pain exploded, and a scream ripped from his throat, but he clenched his teeth, swallowing it. "Nigger thinks he's tough," Swastika growled, slamming a fist into Jamal's jaw, blood spraying the wall. "Holt says you're done," Scarlett snarled, cranking the hose higher. Water flooded his nose, his mouth, choking him. Was this how it ended? Could he hold on through this hell? The torture stretched into days, a relentless cycle of water and voltage. They came at odd hours, waking him from fitful sleep with icy blasts, prods sizzling against wet skin, fists pounding his already broken body. "Quit fighting," one hissed, stomping on his hand until bones crunched. "Holt owns this town," another spat, waterboarding him again, the cloth over his face a suffocating shroud. Jamal's world narrowed to survival. His photographic memory was a lifeline. He recited laws in his head, Section 12, Section 19, a rhythm against the pain keeping him sane. His voice rasped with defiance when they paused. "You're criminals. I'll prove it." They laughed, but their eyes flickered, a crack in their cruelty. By the 6th day, a new guard appeared. Younger, black, his face tight with unease. He slipped in alone, carrying a tray, no hose, no prod. "Eat," he muttered, setting it down. A stale sandwich and water. Jamal squinted through swollen eyes, suspicion flaring. "Why are you helping?" The guard glanced at the door, his voice low. "I heard the tape. Holt's dirty." "You're right." He hesitated, then slid a burner phone from his pocket, dropping it beside the tray. "Make it quick." Jamal's pulse spiked, hope flaring faintly. Was this real? Could he trust this lifeline? He grabbed the phone, fingers trembling, and dialed. "Aisha," he rasped. She answered fast, her voice sharp with worry. "Jamal, you alive?" He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Barely. Solitary. They're torturing me. Waterboarding, prods, everything." Aisha cursed, static crackling. "I'll get it out. Live. Hold on." The line cut, and the guard snatched the phone, bolting as boots echoed outside. Jamal sank back, the sandwich untouched, the spark flaring brighter. If Aisha could broadcast this, Holt's grip might slip. But the guards returned. Scarlett sniffed betrayal, and the beatings doubled. Water choked him until he blacked out. Morning broke, and the city erupted. Aisha's crew hacked every radio, every stream. Jamal's voice rasped through. "They're torturing me. Holt's orders. Don't let him win." Protests surged nationwide, streets clogging with millions, signs blazing, "Save Jamal," in furious red. News vans swarmed the prison, the feds scrambling under the spotlight. Their raid on Aisha's hideout was now a stain. Inside, Jamal heard faint chants through thick walls, a lifeline piercing the dark. Scarlett stormed in, face purple, but a suited man followed, barking orders. "Out, now." The guards withdrew, and the suited man unlocked Jamal's chains. His voice clipped. "Public pressure. You're free." Jamal staggered out, sunlight blinding after days in the void. Aisha met him at the gate, her braids wild, eyes red from sleepless nights. "You did it," she said, steadying him as he swayed, his body a map of bruises and cuts. "They couldn't keep you quiet." He nodded, his throat raw, the chants a roar in his ears. Protesters swarmed, hands reaching to lift him up, a hero forged in pain. The feds backed off, Holt's name now a curse on every tongue. For a moment, Jamal tasted triumph. A wind carved from his own blood. He'd broken their silence, turned their torture into a weapon. Was this the tipping point? Had Holt finally overplayed his hand? But the victory shattered quickly. Aisha's phone buzzed. A prison contact on the line, voice shaking. "Darius, he's been stabbed. Critical." Holt's crew got to him inside. Jamal's legs buckled, Aisha catching him as the world tilted. "No," he rasped, tears cutting through the grime on his face.
No.
The crowd hushed, sensing the blow, and Aisha pulled him to her car, speeding toward the hospital, 40 miles away. Jamal stared out, numb. The recorder's truth was now a hollow echo. Darius, his anchor, his fight, slipping away. Holt's vengeance striking where it hurt most. They reached the ward, the antiseptic stinging Jamal's nose as he stumbled to Darius's bed. His brother lay pale, tubes snaking from his chest, blood seeping through bandages. A guard stood nearby, smirking. A Holt loyalist, untouched by the feds. "Accident," he muttered. But Jamal knew better. Holt's reach stretched even here, a blade in the dark. Darius's eyes fluttered, weak but alive, and he gripped Jamal's hand, his voice a whisper. "You're winning, little man. Don't stop." Jamal choked, nodding, but the monitor flatlined. A scream tore from his throat as nurses rushed in. Darius was gone. Holt's final cut, and Jamal's world crumbled. Triumph drowned in loss. Across town, Holt watched the hospital feed on a private screen. A grin split his granite face. He poured bourbon, the ice clinking, and toasted the air. "Checkmate, boy," he muttered, savoring the kill. But Jamal, kneeling by Darius's body, felt rage ignite through the grief. A fire Holt couldn't extinguish. He'd lost everything, but he'd fight harder now. For Darius, for Lena, for every name on that tape. Jamal Carter stood in the hospital corridor, the antiseptic stench burning his nose as Darius's body lay still behind the glass. The flatline's echo clawed at his skull, a sound he couldn't unhear. His brother's last words, "Don't stop," a fire in his battered chest. His arm hung limp, blood crusting the sling. His ribs a jagged ache from days of torture. Aisha gripped his shoulder, her braids brushing his ear. "We've got to move. Retrials in 2 hours." Jamal nodded, wiping tears with a bruised hand. Rage swallowed his grief. Holt had taken everything, Lena, his home, now Darius. But Holt would pay today. They sped back, Aisha's hatchback weaving through a city on fire. Protests choked the streets, smoke rising from torched cars. Chance of justice for Jamal was a war cry against Holt's empire. The courthouse loomed, a gray fortress, ringed with riot cops, their shields glinting in the noon sun. Jamal stumbled out, borrowed blazer torn, his swollen face a map of war. Reporters swarmed, cameras rolling, but he pushed through, every step a fight against collapse. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and fury. The gallery packed to bursting, live feeds beaming nationwide. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. Holt swept in, robes billowing, his granite face etched with venom. His buzz cut gleamed under the lights, but his eyes flickered, a king sensing his throne crack. The crowd hushed, tension coiling tight as he settled onto the bench, gavel in hand. "Order," he boomed, his voice a thunderclap, but it wavered, a hairline fracture in his control. Jamal took the podium, legs trembling, the hospital records clutched in his good hand. Proof, the evidence of Darius's stabbing. A guard's initials scrawled on the transfer order. "Your Honor," he rasped, voice raw but steady. "Darius Carter was murdered in prison. Your orders. I've got the evidence." He slid the records forward. The bailiff passed them up, and Holt snatched them, jaw clenching as he read. "This proves nothing," Holt snapped, tossing the papers down. "A thug got what he deserved." Jamal's blood boiled. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Thugs? You're a killer. You run a racket, frame kids, cash in on their lives. The emails, the tape, now this. You're caught." Holt's face turned purple, a vein bulging, but Jamal didn't stop. He pulled the recorder from his pocket, its tape still intact. "Play it," he said, handing it over. "Let them hear you." The bailiff hesitated, but Aisha shouted from the gallery. "Do it!" The crowd roared in approval, and Holt's glare faltered, sweat beading on his thick neck. The tape spun. Holt's voice spilled out, cold and damning. 10 grand per head. Black teens priority. Gasps ripped through the room, followed by shouts and fists pounding benches. Jamal pressed on, holding up the hospital log. You ordered Darius stabbed to shut me up. Guard T. Rollins signed it. Your man. Holt slammed the gavel, a desperate crack, but his voice shook. This is a setup. You forged it all, boy. Jamal's eyes blazed, trapping Holt in the lie. Forged like your cops forged my arrest. Like Tom forged my evidence. You're unraveling, Holt. He pointed to the log. Rollins confessed on tape, too. Said you paid him 5 grand to stick Darius. It's over. The gallery erupted, a tidal wave of outrage. Protesters banged on the doors outside. Holt stood, towering over the bench, and roared. Silence! But his control slipped, a snarl twisting his face as he grabbed the gavel like a weapon. Jamal saw the crack, the rage boiling over, and pushed harder. Admit it. You killed my brother. Holt snapped. His granite mask shattered, and he hurled the gavel across the room, with splintering against the wall. You little bastard, he bellowed, his voice a primal howl, lunging over the bench. The crowd screamed. Cameras caught every second as he charged Jamal, a chair crashing behind him. Bailiffs rushed in, grabbing Holt's arms, but he thrashed, spitting, eyes wild with hate. I'll bury you all, he roared, robes tangling as he fell. A king dethroned, live on TV, Jamal stood his ground, heart pounding from the chaos of victory he had bled for. The jury, wide-eyed, whispered amongst themselves. The truth was undeniable now. Order crumbled as protesters stormed the doors, flooding the courtroom with raised fists and deafening voices. Holt was dragged back, cuffs snapping around his wrists, his buzz cut matted with sweat as he spat curses. The jury forewoman stood, her voice cutting through the noise. We've seen enough. Darius Carter's case was cleared. Not guilty. Cheers exploded, a thunderclap of relief, but Jamal barely heard, staggering to Aisha's side. She pulled him into the hall, away from the chaos, as the feds swarmed in. Holt's arrest blazed across screens. You did it, she whispered, steadying him. He's down. They raced back to the hospital. Jamal's legs buckled as he reached Darius's room. His brother lay still, a sheet pulled over his face, but Jamal knelt, gripping his cold hand. Tears carved through the grime on his cheeks. I got you free, he choked. The triumph felt hollow. Darius's death was a wound Holt's cuffs couldn't heal. Aisha stood silent, her camera off, giving him this moment. The city burned outside, protests morphing into riots. But here time stopped. Grief and victory tangled tight. He'd won, exposed Holt, cleared Darius's name. But the cost was a brother he'd never hug again. Then the ground shook. A blast ripped through the air, glass shattering as a fireball erupted outside the hospital. Screams pierced the ward, nurses diving for cover. Jamal spun, heart slamming. Smoke billowed from the courthouse 3 blocks away, the echo of a bomb rattling his bones. Aisha yanked him down, debris raining. Holt's crew, she hissed. The TV flickered on, a breaking news banner flashing. Explosion at courthouse. Dozens dead. Jamal's stomach dropped, the victory souring fast. Holt, cuffed in a van, grinned on the feed, a predator unshaken, even in chains. Jamal stumbled to the window, smoke choking the sky, sirens wailing, a new war unfolding. The blast was Holt's final card, a massacre to punish the city that dared defy him. Bodies littered the streets, protesters and cops alike. Blood pooled in the chaos. Aisha gripped his arm, her face pale. He planned this, even locked up. He's hitting back. Jamal's fists clenched, rage surging through the grief. He'd torn Holt down, but the judge had torched the board, a parting shot that left dozens dead. The hospital trembled, patients screaming, and Jamal knew this wasn't the end. Holt's war was just beginning. Across town, Holt sat in the feds' van, cuffs glinting. His granite face split with a smirk. He'd lost the bench, but his network burned bright. A bomb, his last laugh. Jamal's victory had cost too much, and the judge reveled in it. A king fallen but unbroken. In the war, Jamal stood over Darius, resolve hardening through the tears. Holt thought he'd won this round, but Jamal wasn't finished. Not yet. Jamal Carter stood by the hospital window, the acrid smoke from the courthouse bomb stinging his eyes as it clawed through the shattered glass. The city burned below, a hell's cape of fire and screams. The blast's echo still rattled his bruised ribs. Darius lay dead behind him, a sheet covering his face. His last words, "Don't stop," a chain binding Jamal to this war. His arm hung limp in the sling, blood seeping through his swollen jaw, throbbing from days of torture. Aisha crouched beside him, her braids tangled with debris. "Holt's crew did this," she whispered over the chaos. "Even cuffed, he's killing." Jamal's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. Rage was a live wire through his grief. This wasn't justice, it was slaughter. Outside, the streets erupted. Riots tore through the city, a tidal wave of fury sparked by the bomb. Protesters clashed with riot cops. Molotovs arced through the air, shattering against shields in bursts of flame. Sirens wailed, a useless howl against the carnage. Looters smashed storefronts, glass raining like confetti. Jamal watched, heart pounding, as a sniper shot cracked from a rooftop, dropping a protester mid-scream. Blood pooled on the pavement. Another fired, then another. A chorus of death orchestrated by Holt's unseen hands. Aisha yanked him back, glass crunching underfoot. "They're everywhere. We've got to hide." But Jamal's eyes stayed fixed on the inferno. Had he sparked this? Was Darius's freedom worth this blood? They fled the ward, Aisha leading him through back halls. Nurses scrambled past with stretchers. The hospital trembled, power flickering as generators groaned under strain. Jamal's legs shook, every step a fight against collapse. But he clutched the recorder, its tape a lifeline through the haze. They reached a janitor's closet, a cramped hole stinking of bleach, and barricaded the door with a mop. Aisha pulled her laptop from her bag. The screen was cracked but glowing. She hacked into a live feed. The city unspooled in chaos. Fires gutted downtown. Cops beat kids with batons. Snipers picked off anyone who dared stand tall. "Holt's network," she muttered, fingers flying. He planned this if he fell. Jamal sank against the wall, the recorder's weight a stone in his hand. "He's not alone," he rasped, his voice raw from screaming Darius's name. Aisha nodded, pulling files from the dark web. Her earlier breach into Holt's server now a gold mine. "Look!" She spun the screen toward him. Emails flashing. Holt to a council, names coded but the power clear. Judges, CEOs, a shadow cabal bleeding the city dry. One stood out. A directive dated weeks ago. If exposed, burn it all. Leave no trace. Jamal's stomach twisted. The bomb's purpose clicked into place. This wasn't just revenge. It was a purge. A system shielding itself with fire and lead. He grabbed the laptop, his good hand trembling as he scrolled through another file. A list of payoffs linked Holt to private prisons, police chiefs, even a senator's aide. "They're bigger than him," he said, his voice rising. "A whole damn machine." Aisha's eyes widened, but she kept typing, uploading the files to her whistleblower site. "We leak this, it's war. Not just Holt. Everyone." Jamal nodded, resolve hardening through the pain. "Let it burn. They've taken enough." The files hit the net, a digital Molotov racing through cyberspace. Within minutes, news feeds screamed. Holt's cabal exposed. Corruption network unveiled. The city's roar grew louder, a beast awakening to its chains. Feds swarmed in black vans, cutting through the smoke. Their raid was a belated attempt to regain control. Aisha's leak had forced their hand. Agents stormed precincts, courthouses, corporate towers, snapping cuffs on dozens. Cops, clerks, suits with blood on their ledgers. Jamal watched from the closet's cracked window, the chaos reflecting his soul. Protesters cheered as Holt's cronies were dragged out, their faces pale under flashing lights. But the snipers kept firing, a final gasp of defiance. Aisha's phone buzzed. Contact from the prison. They're moving fast. The voice crackled. Holt still pulling strings, even locked up. Jamal's jaw clenched. Of course, he was. They slipped out of the hospital, a madhouse of the wounded and grieving, and raced to a new hideout, a basement under a burned-out church. Jamal clung to Darius's memory, the recorder his only anchor, while Aisha patched into police chatter. The feds had Holt in a max security van, but his network fought back. Bombs rocking the suburbs, cops turning rogue to protect their paymasters. Jamal hacked a burner phone, sending the cabal files to every news outlet. His voice was a ghost on the airwaves. They killed my brother. They're killing us all. Stop them. The city heard him. Millions rose in response, but the cost was a river of blood. Night fell, and the basement shook with footsteps pounding above. Aisha froze, the laptop glowing. As the door splintered open, a hit squad burst in, 6 men in black tactical gear, guns raised, eyes cold behind masks. Carter, one barked, rifle trained. Holt says goodbye. Jamal lunged for the recorder, but a boot smashed into his hand, bones crunching as he screamed. Aisha swung a pipe, cracking a skull, but they swarmed her. A shot rang out, blood spraying as she fell. Jamal roared, diving for her, but a barrel pressed to his temple, freezing him cold. Move, and you're next. The leader snarled, dragging him up. They hauled him out into the church's ruins, smoldering around them, and threw him into a van. The drive was a blur, tires screeching through a city of flame until they stopped at the hospital again. A twisted, full circle. Jamal stumbled in, cuffed and bleeding, the squad shoving him to Darius's room. His brother's body was gone, the bed empty, but a guard waited, smirking, a blade still wet with blood. Holt's orders, he said, twirling the blade. Took him out slow. Now you. Jamal's heart stopped. The guard's grin mirrored Holt's, but then a crash echoed. Feds breached the ward, guns blazing. The squad turned, firing back, and Jamal Dove, rolling under the bed as bullets tore the room apart. The firefight was chaos, bodies dropping, blood pooling, but Jamal crawled free, the recorder lost in the fray. He staggered out, smoke choking his lungs, and found Aisha's car keys still in it. He drove blind, tears blurring his vision, to a safe house across town. A friend's attic he'd memorized months ago. There he collapsed. The city's wail, a dirge for Darius, for Aisha, for everyone. Holt's cabal had crushed him. The TV flickered on, feds parading arrested suits, but the news cut to Holt in his cell, grinning through the bars. It's not over, he mouthed. The promise chilled Jamal's blood. Jamal sat alone in the attic, a coffin of grief. His vow to fight now a blade without a sheath. The cabal was exposed, dozens cuffed, but Darius was gone, Aisha missing, and Holt's network still burned the city to ash. He had lit the match, but the fire consumed everything he loved, and the hit squad's raid proved Holt's reach was unbroken, even in chains. He clutched his broken hand, rage a furnace in his chest, and swore revenge. A lone warrior against a hydra, he had only begun to cut. Jamal Carter crouched in the attic of his friend's safe house, the city's distant wail seeping through the cracked roof. Smoke hung thick outside, a shroud over a battlefield where Holt's network had torched everything he knew. His broken hand throbbed, bones grinding under swollen skin, his arm limp in the blood-rusted sling. Darius was gone, stolen from the hospital by Holt's hit squad, and Aisha's fate gnawed at him, her blood on the church floor, a ghost in his mind. The TV flickered in the corner. Holt's grin taunted him from a cell. The cabal's arrests, a hollow win against the chaos. Jamal's chest burned with rage, a vow to end this war the only thing keeping him upright. He had to find Darius, dead or alive. He tracked the squad's path, his memory his map through the wreckage. The hospital raid replayed in his head. The guard's wet blade, the feds' gunfire, the van's screeching tires. They'd taken Darius somewhere close, a gut hunch he couldn't shake. He slipped out at dusk, stealing a hoodie from the attic to mask his battered face, and moved through alleys. Every shadow was a threat. The city smoldered, riot cops clashing with looters, but Jamal navigated the chaos, homing in on a mansion 5 miles north. A hulking silhouette he'd seen in Holt's leaked emails, a coded address tied to council orders. Was this their lair? Had they dragged Darius here to finish him? He crept through the grounds, scaling a rusted gate, mud sucking at his sneakers. The mansion loomed, windows dark but alive with faint hums, generators, voices, a fortress unbowed by the Fed's sweep. Jamal slipped inside through a cellar hatch. The air was thick with damp and metal, his broken hand screaming as he gripped a pipe for balance. Footsteps echoed above. He climbed, emerging in a hall lined with locked doors. A scream cut through, Darius's voice, weak but defiant, a beacon pulling him forward. He followed it, heart slamming, to a steel door guarded by a lone thug, a gun slung low. Jamal lunged, the pipe cracking the man's skull with a dull thud as he crumpled. The door creaked open, revealing a nightmare. Darius hung from chains, shirtless, blood streaking his chest, a torturer's blade still wet in his limp hand. His eyes fluttered, alive but fading. Jamal rushed in, dropping the pipe to cradle his brother's face. "I'm here," he choked, tears cutting through grime. Darius's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "Knew you'd come, little man." But his breath rattled shallow, and Jamal's hands shook, fumbling with the chains. A screen flickered on the wall. Holt's face grinned through static. "Free on bail," his voice purred venomously. "Too late, boy. You thought you won." Jamal's blood froze. The judge's laugh felt like a blade in his gut. But then the twist landed. A shadow moved behind him. A figure stepped into the light. Tall, black, in a tailored suit. His face was a mirror of Jamal's mom, older, harder. "Enough," the man said, his voice smooth but cold, halting the torturer mid-swing. Jamal spun, Darius slipping from his grasp. Confusion crashed through his rage. "Who are you?" he rasped, but the answer hit like a bomb. "Malcolm Carter," the man said, eyes glinting. "Your uncle. Holt works for me." Jamal's world tilted. The air sucked from his lungs. Uncle Malcolm, the family ghost, a billionaire who had vanished decades ago, now stood before him, the true king of the cabal. Malcolm smirked, pacing the room, his polished shoes clicking against blood-streaked concrete. "I built this, Holt, the prisons, the profits. All mine. You're a glitch, nephew, but a clever one." Jamal's fists clenched, broken hand be damned. Darius coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "You sold us out," he spat, his voice breaking. "Your own blood." Malcolm shrugged, unmoved. "Blood's cheap. Power isn't. I clawed my way out of this dirt and built a throne. You should have stayed small." He nodded to the torturer, who raised his blade again. But Jamal lunged, tackling the man. A scream tore free as steel grazed his side. The room erupted into chaos. Jamal fought with feral desperation, his broken hand swinging, his good one clawing. The torturer collapsed, skull cracking against the floor. But Malcolm was already drawing a gun, sleek, silver, aimed calmly at Jamal's chest. "Pity," he murmured, finger tightening on the trigger. Then Darius surged, chains snapping loose. With the last of his strength, he threw himself at Malcolm, a dying man's final stand. The gun fired. The bullet tore through Darius's heart. He collapsed, blood pooling as Malcolm staggered back, his pristine suit now stained red. Jamal roared, diving for his brother, cradling him as the life drained from his eyes. "Finish it," Darius gasped. Then he went still. Flames licked the walls, smoke billowing. The mansion was a trap, rigged to burn. Malcolm vanished into the haze, his gun clattering to the floor. A king fleeing his own fire. Jamal dragged Darius's lifeless body through the choking smoke, stumbling out just as the roof collapsed behind him, fire swallowing everything. He fell into the mud outside, clutching a USB drive he had ripped from the torturer's pocket. Secrets, codes, the cabal's beating heart. The city smoldered beyond him, Holt's smug grin flickering on every screen. But now, Jamal knew the real enemy. Malcolm's shadow loomed behind it all. Jamal rose, tears carving through soot-streaked skin, and swore to dismantle them all. A lone warrior with nothing left but a fight that would never end. Jamal Carter's story is a raw testament to resilience, betrayal, and the cost of justice in a world built to crush the powerless. His journey proves that brilliance can emerge from the margins. A black teen with a photographic memory, toppling a corrupt empire when no one else dared. His relentless fight against Judge Holt's system of oppression shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of moving through it. Every beating, every loss, only fueled his defiance. Yet, the story also warns of trust's fragility. Tom's betrayal, Uncle Malcolm's treachery, proof that the deepest wounds come from those closest, and power corrupts absolutely. The hardest lesson? Sacrifice. Jamal's victories cleared Darius's name, but they couldn't save his life. A brutal reminder that justice often demands a price higher than triumph can repay. Holt's cabal, a network of judges and tycoons, exposes how systemic racism isn't just personal hatred. It's an entire machine, grinding lives for profit. Resilient even when exposed. Jamal's final vow, clutching that USB in a city burning around him, proves the fight against such evil is never truly won. It's a war passed from one warrior to the next. This story forces us to question: who really holds power? How do we fight the systems that crush us? And when the cost of resistance feels unbearable, will we still stand firm? Because silence is complicity. So what would you risk to expose the truth like Jamal did? Comment below. Like and subscribe if this story of grit and betrayal resonated with you. And share it to keep the conversation alive. Thanks for joining this journey through a city on fire. May you find the strength to fight your own battles and light in the darkest corners.